It is truly impressive when we discover in conscious thought how the structure of every organism becomes real and is sustained by its own internally regulated system long before thought itself appears. The further we venture into the depths of the developmental process, the greater our respect for this law. We have only to observe the crystallization of the primal units of any single organism to see its logical, step-by-step progression. We can witness how infinite repetitions of the one original shape of the initial microscopic ovum create a characteristic cell structure from which vessels, nerves, muscles, and bones develop according to specific radiations and metamorphoses. We then begin to understand what unself-conscious wisdom, power, and beauty a divine spark can reveal in becoming an individual. The unavoidable question then arises, can the free activity of the conscious soul reach the heights of beauty, wealth, and inner perfection that the unconscious activity of the principle underlying the soul unfolds before our eyes daily and hourly? All that has been said about the relationship and opposition between nature and art is in point here. Art cannot really create anything at all, and we must see that the forms of the unconscious force are infinitely superior, both in terms of inner perfection and efficiency, to anything the conscious mind can produce. When it becomes clear that what we call the science of the conscious soul is but a pursuit and a search for the relationships and laws continually operative in the unconscious activity of every living thing around us, from planets to blood corpuscles, a specific evolution or cycle of the world of ideas becomes clear. This cycle is the development of consciousness from the unconscious, with consciousness in turn searching for the unconscious. Consciousness can only be satisfied through the attainment of the best possible understanding of the unconscious. But of course, it finally becomes apparent even here that a perfect understanding of nature through scientific means is impossible, and a gap must always remain. Speculating thus, we also become aware of the remarkable conditions in man himself. When we are satisfied that our organism, quite apart from any conscious life that will later develop from it and in it, shows a perfection, a variety and inner functionalism not found so extensively in any other organism, we must be filled with awe for man, irrespective of his individual worth. In the human person, however poorly developed his conscious mind may be, indeed, even if he has lost all dignity as a conscious being, a wisdom, a functionalism, even a certain beauty of inner life can be recognized, which we must admire more and more the further we progress in our knowledge of such matters. Many of man's earliest and most widespread concepts can be explained by his veneration for the unconscious, even if he is not fully aware of it. The awe before the nature of a child, even before a higher conscious life has developed in it. The reluctance to kill a man, or the Hindu reluctance to destroy any animal life at all, and the frequent veneration of the human and even animal form as something divine. Of course, where knowledge has lagged behind, misunderstanding of these concepts has flourished. What was only partly divine, a single manifestation of the absolute God, was taken for divinity itself. This indeed demonstrates the origin of the real error of pantheism, the belief that many individual things have absolute divinity. Pantheism is in complete opposition to what might be called entheism, i.e., the perception of divinity in everything. Obviously, entheism is the one and only healthy Weltanschauung. Absolute pantheism, however, like real antheism, is too absurd ever to satisfy fully any intelligent, cultivated person. Incidentally, in its teachings on these matters, present-day theology, just like a very widespread kind of physiology, moves in a peculiar circle. The perfection and wisdom of the divine in nature and in the organization of man is recognized, its study indeed recommended to further the knowledge of the divine. Yet a distinction is made between the unconscious functioning of the divine, which is individuating, and the conscious divine aspect, which we perceive in the fully developed human soul. Vis-a-vis the soul, the unconscious power is in turn called life force, which is sometimes debased to a mere mechanism. Sometimes it is even conceived of as demonic. Thus, theology has all but placed it as a manifestation of the evil satanic principle. In direct opposition to the conscious soul, the manifestation of the good and truly divine principle. But the inner truly divine perfection of everything produced under the unconscious rule of the soul cannot possibly be denied. These misconceptions are only mentioned in passing, but they stray further from the truth than pantheism itself. Earlier we pointed out how difficult it is for the conscious region of the psyche to grasp the suffering and activity of the unconscious. But the key to a genuine psychology can only be found there. Let us, therefore, now try to further our argument by observing how many things move and fulfill themselves only unconsciously, even when we are in a state of consciousness. For instance, there can be no doubt that the muscles that control breathing obey the bidding of the conscious soul through nerve impulses. We can hinder these movements for some time. We can purposely speed them up, interrupt, strengthen or weaken them, and thus experience their full dependence on our conscious mind. And yet, normally these movements are carried out continuously and entirely unconsciously throughout our lives. This shows us that the boundary between conscious and the unconscious is most flexible, and that both are manifestations of one and the same striking unity. This shows us that the boundary between consciousness and the unconscious is most flexible, and that both are manifestations of one and the same unity. There is perhaps even more striking in all movements serving any artistic or manual skill. Here, though entirely conscious and executed by muscles obeying the will, what we call studying or practicing is nothing but an attempt to return something that has become conscious to the region of the unconscious. Consider the pianist. Every individual placing and lifting of the fingers is at first an act of will, and has to be produced by deliberately released nerve impulses acting to stimulate the appropriate muscles. If these movements are repeated often enough, they sink slowly into the realm of the unconscious in their particular pattern and are thus withdrawn from consciousness. They no longer need to be thought out individually. Simply thinking of certain tone sequences is sufficient to evoke them as a whole, and in any desired tempo, with the same certainty as breathing that occurs without our thinking about it. The same is true of our most essential movements in space, e.g. walking. These facts prove conclusively that the ability to transfer skills and knowledge from conscious into the unconscious truly belongs to the height of human perfection. The psychologist should pay attention to this fact, which has not yet been adequately studied, although Jörg Ernst Stahl has very definitely pointed out much in this connection. It is certainly very striking that man's actions, skills and artistic abilities run along lines very similar to cognition, knowledge and science. The deeper man's conscious cognition permeates into the ideas and laws unconsciously governing his own organism and the world about him, the more science can achieve. Psychology's most important task is to penetrate into regions where the life of the soul is entirely unconscious. Similarly, every skill becomes real art only when all activity, insofar as it serves a particular purpose of the will, is executed unconsciously. Then the conscious mind can dispense with the individual deliberations of the will that are necessary to execute any given act. Only the true and dynamic purpose need to be in the mind, and the artistic activity commences freshly and easily. If we now turn back to conscious knowledge, cognition, bearing in mind its origin in the unconscious, we can understand why Plato portrayed all cognition as remembrance, as a finding within, i.e., finding it where there was no knowledge, and where this truth, this thought still existed, like the unconscious embryo in the conscious mother. Socrates, therefore, often suggests that the development of thought, the attainment of higher knowledge, is like an act aiding birth. This certainly indicates the rich, strange world we carry within us. Pursuing this train of thought, we must at once perceive more clearly the striking relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. Perhaps, too, consideration of the gradual appearance of inherited special tendencies of the conscious soul can throw an even brighter light on this problem. Clearly, we must go back into the history of the idea of our being, and thus into the realm of unconscious being, if we want to find the primary cause for our individuality. In this context, I first want to point out how many distinct characteristics of the conscious life of the soul can be handed down from parent to child. How characteristic mental tendencies, special inclinations, and artistic talents thus become the property of persons, frequently manifesting themselves rather late, even though they must always have been latent. We can then realize how entirely unconscious the soul must have been when such transferences were possible. I refer to the first formative stages of the ovum. To perceive one of the most striking and instructive factors in the history of the relation between consciousness and the unconscious, we should realize that all mental characteristics that come to the surface later in conscious life are present in the soul of the embryo, while it is still acting solely as a formative developing power, requisitioning and distributing matter. We shall then see how completely the conscious life of the soul lies in the region of the unconscious and emerges from it, how the first real creative act of the idea, incarnated as the soul, is to establish the basis for the marvellous variety of an organism that is as yet quite unconscious, and how later, when consciousness has unfolded itself as the reflection of the basic idea in this creation, the unconscious radiation of that divine spark constitutes the ever-flowing spring that continuously enriches our consciousness. As deep an understanding as possible of the basic idea acting unconsciously within us is essential for a science of the psyche. Therefore, we must sketch the history of the growing organism, especially of the growing human organism. In particular, we must clearly understand the nature of the formative process, but not necessarily all of its ramifications. This knowledge has only recently come to light in studies that are still completely foreign to the layman and to many doctors. Only from this clarity of insight will we be permitted to come to a conclusion on the characteristic activity of the unconsciously unfolding life of the soul. As early as the 17th century, Stahl thought that only the soul was the real creative and formative force of the organism, but he had no access to a clearer concept of the formative process and the actual relationship of an idea to its realization in form. His notion of the materiality of the soul kept him from recognizing the whole essence of these relationships. He realized the difference between the conscious and the unconscious life of the soul, and said quite rightly that unconscious and involuntary actions in the organism happen ratione, but not ratiocinio. This discovery so satisfied him that he regarded the physiology of his contemporary, Hoffmann, with contempt. He even came into conflict with Leibniz. While Leibniz admittedly had a more correct conception of the soul's immaterial essence, he supposed a second entelechy, the force of movement, in the organism exterior to the soul. He was less familiar with its relationship to the organism. Stahl, of course, rejected this, since the concept of the unity of the organism had become clear to him.